The Irish are an ethnic group and a nation native to the island of Ireland, defined by a shared ancestry, a long historical continuity, and a culture that developed locally over many millennia. Human presence in Ireland goes back around 33,000 years, and the island has been continuously inhabited for more than 10,000 years. For most of its recorded history, Ireland was dominated by a Gaelic population, often referred to as Gaelic Ireland, where society was shaped by the Irish language, kinship-based organization, and indigenous social and legal systems that existed long before sustained external rule. From the 9th century onward, Ireland began to experience limited settlement from outside groups. Vikings first arrived as raiders and later established small settlements along the coast, gradually integrating with the local population and forming the Norse Gaels. In the 12th century, parts of Ireland were conquered by the Anglo-Normans, who introduced new political structures and forms of land control. These changes did not erase Gaelic society, but added new layers to Ireland's historical development. Later, during the 16th and 17th centuries, England's conquest and colonization brought significant numbers of English settlers and lowland Scots, particularly into northern regions of the island, fundamentally altering Ireland's political and demographic landscape. As a result of these historical processes, modern Ireland is divided into two political entities. Most of the island forms the Republic of Ireland, officially called Ireland, while Northern Ireland, located in the northeast, remains part of the United Kingdom. Despite these political divisions and centuries of foreign influence, the Irish retained a strong and distinct cultural identity, rooted in earlier Gaelic traditions. Irish culture developed its own customs, language, music, dance, sports, cuisine, and mythology, many of which continue to be recognized today. Historically, Irish, or Gaelge, was the dominant language across the island, although English gradually replaced it as the primary spoken language, especially under English rule. Today, English is the first language of most Irish people, while Irish remains an important cultural and symbolic marker of national identity. In earlier periods, Irish society was organized around kin groups or clans, which formed the basic units of political and social life. These clans were central to systems of landholding, loyalty, and governance. The Irish also developed their own religious traditions, legal code, alphabet, and distinctive styles of dress. Their legal system, known as Brehon law, governed Irish society for centuries and differed significantly from the legal traditions introduced later by outside powers. Modern census data provides insight into how Irish identity is expressed today. In the Republic of Ireland's 2022 census, approximately 3.89 million people out of a total population of around 5.08 million identified their ethnicity as White Irish, meaning they self-reported as Irish in the ethnic group category. In Northern Ireland's 2021 census, about 33.3% of the population, out of roughly 1.9 million residents, identified as Irish in terms of national identity, with respondents able to select multiple identities, such as Irish, British, or Northern Irish. Beyond Ireland itself, Irish ancestry is widespread across the world. It is estimated that between 50 and 80 million people globally have some degree of Irish ancestry. Large communities of Irish descendants are found in English-speaking countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, while significant populations also exist in Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Germany, and the United Arab Emirates. Among all of these countries, the United States has the largest population of people of Irish descent, reflecting centuries of migration from Ireland. The key genetic traits that characterize the Irish population today have been present in Ireland since the early Bronze Age, around 4,000 years ago. Genetic studies show that Ireland has some of the highest frequencies in the world of the RL21Y chromosome haplotype, as well as a very high prevalence of lactase persistence, which is the ability to digest milk into adulthood. Both traits are strongly associated with long-term population continuity on the island. Among Irish males, haplogroup R1b is overwhelmingly dominant, reaching a frequency of nearly 80%. This haplogroup is also common across much of Western Europe, but in Ireland a particular subclade, R1b L21, stands out. This subclade reaches a frequency of about 65% across the island and is likewise dominant in Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. Genetic evidence suggests that these populations descend from a common ancestor who lived around 2500 BC, indicating deep shared ancestry among insular Celtic populations. Although modern Irish people do carry some ancestry from the early European farmers who lived in Ireland during the Neolithic period, this component forms only a small proportion of their genetic makeup. The majority of Irish ancestry derives from Western steppe herders, a population that originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe and spread into Western Europe during the early Bronze Age. This migration played a decisive role in shaping the genetic profile of Ireland's later populations. Archaeogenetic research has helped clarify how this process unfolded on the island itself. Studies of ancient remains from Ireland indicate that the earlier Neolithic farming population was genetically most similar to present-day Sardinians. In contrast, 3 Bronze Age men buried on Rathlin Island between 2000 and 1500 BC were found to be most similar to modern Irish people. All 3 belonged to the RL21 haplogroup and carried the gene for lactase persistence, providing strong evidence of genetic continuity in Ireland from the Bronze Age through to the present. It is considered likely that these Bronze Age populations carrying the RL21 haplogroup were responsible for bringing the bell beaker culture to Ireland. Researchers have also suggested that they introduced an Indo-European language that later developed into the insular Celtic languages, including Gaelic. Today, RL21 remains the dominant haplogroup not only in Ireland but also in Western Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, and is therefore closely associated with insular Celtic peoples. More recent genetic studies have shown that the Irish population can be divided into several regional genetic clusters. A 2017 study identified 10 such clusters, 7 of which are associated with predominantly Gaelic Irish ancestry, and 3 of which reflect shared Irish-British ancestry. The genetic differences among the Gaelic clusters are relatively small and align closely with historical provincial and kingdom boundaries in Ireland. The most pronounced contrast appears between native Gaelic Irish populations and Ulster Protestants, who are known to have more recent partial British ancestry. That same research identified 2 major ancestral components shaping the Irish genome. One component, labeled Northwestern France, reaches its highest levels among the Irish and other Celtic populations such as the Welsh, Highland Scots, and Cornish. The other, a West Norway component, is associated with the Viking period and reflects Scandinavian influence during that era. Compared to other populations in the British Isles, Irish people have the lowest proportion of Anglo-Saxon ancestry, at around 10%. This is significantly less than in Scotland and Wales, where approximately 30% of the genome is of Anglo-Saxon origin. This genetic pattern reinforces the picture of Ireland as a population with strong continuity from the Bronze Age and comparatively limited genetic input from later Anglo-Saxon migrations. Over the past 33,000 years, Ireland has seen several waves of human presence shaped by dramatic environmental changes. During the last glacial maximum, vast ice sheets more than 3,000 meters thick covered much of the island, carving and scouring the landscape. Around 24,000 years ago, these glaciers extended beyond Ireland's southern coast. By roughly 16,000 years ago, they had begun to retreat, leaving behind an ice bridge that still connected Ireland to Scotland. By about 14,000 years ago, Ireland became completely isolated from Britain. This glacial period formally ended around 11,700 years ago, leaving Ireland without glaciers but transformed into a cold, Arctic tundra environment. In the early Holocene, Ireland's climate remained harsh and inhospitable for most European plants and animals, making long-term human settlement unlikely, although fishing along the coast was possible. For a long time, archaeologists believed that the earliest modern humans arrived in Ireland during the late Paleolithic period, shortly after the retreat of the ice. This understanding changed in recent decades due to new dating techniques. In 2016, radiocarbon dating of a bare bone excavated in 1903 from Alice and Gwendoline Cave in County Clare revealed cut marks made by humans and produced a date of around 10,500 BC, showing that people were present in Ireland soon after the glaciers retreated. Other discoveries have further pushed back the timeline of human activity. A worked flint tool found in 1968 at Mel, near Drogheda, is believed to predate 70,000 BC, though it is generally thought to have been carried into Ireland by glacial movement rather than made locally. More significantly, A reindeer bone fragment discovered in Castleput Cave near Doneraile in County Cork and dated in 2021 to around 33,000 years ago demonstrated human activity in Ireland more than 20,000 years earlier than previously believed. Together, these findings show that human presence on the island stretches much further back into the Paleolithic than once assumed. The last ice age fully ended in Ireland around 8000 BC. Until the 2016 Paleolithic discovery, the earliest widely accepted evidence of human occupation after the ice retreat dated to the Mesolithic period, beginning around 7000 BC. By the time Mesolithic settlers arrived, likely traveling by boat from Britain, the ice bridge between the islands had already disappeared. These early inhabitants were skilled seafarers who relied heavily on marine resources, and even their inland camps were typically established close to rivers, lakes, or coastlines. Archaeological evidence of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers has been found across Ireland. These communities lived on a diverse diet that included seafood, birds, wild boar, and hazelnuts. Their shelters were seasonal and temporary, constructed using wooden frames covered with animal skins or thatch. Population levels during the Mesolithic period were extremely low, likely never exceeding a few thousand people across the entire island, reflecting the limited resources and mobile lifestyle of hunter-gatherer societies. Ireland's transition to the Neolithic period followed a pattern seen elsewhere in Europe, but with some regional variation. Across much of the continent, the Neolithic arrived as a complete package that included cereal crops, domesticated animals, pottery, weaving, permanent housing, and new burial practices. This process began in Central Europe around 6000 BC with the linear pottery culture. In Ireland, evidence suggests that cattle arrived in the north of the island around 4300 BC during the late Mesolithic period, and red deer were introduced from Britain around the same time. By approximately 4500 BC, a full Neolithic package had reached Ireland. This included cereal cultivation, permanent housing, and the construction of stone monuments. Sheep, goats, cattle, and cereal crops were introduced from southwestern continental Europe, leading to a significant rise in population. Wheat and barley became the main crops cultivated by Neolithic farmers, marking a decisive shift away from the hunter-gatherer way of life and laying the foundations for more complex and settled societies in prehistoric Ireland. The Bronze Age in Ireland began with the arrival of metallurgy, introduced by new populations commonly referred to as the Bell Beaker people, named after their distinctive pottery shaped like inverted bells. This period is closely associated with major cultural and technological changes, although there is some scholarly disagreement about its linguistic implications. Some researchers argue that the first speakers of a Celtic language arrived in Ireland with the Beaker people during the Bronze Age, while others believe that Celtic languages reached the island later, at the beginning of the Iron Age. Technologically, the defining feature of the Bronze Age was the production of true bronze through the alloying of copper and tin. Bronze was used extensively to manufacture weapons and tools, including swords, axes, daggers, hatchets, halberds, awls, drinking vessels, and horn-shaped trumpets. Ireland possessed significant copper resources, particularly in the southwest of the island, while tin had to be imported from Cornwall in Britain. The earliest known copper mine in Ireland, and in these islands more broadly, was located at Ross Island near the lakes of Killarney, where mining and metalworking took place between approximately 2400 and 1800 BC. In addition to copper, Ireland was rich in native gold, and the Bronze Age marked the first period of extensive goldworking by Irish craftsmen. More Bronze Age gold hoards have been discovered in Ireland than in any other part of Europe. Irish gold ornaments have been found far beyond the island itself, reaching as far as Germany and Scandinavia. This wide distribution suggests that gold-related trade played an important role in the Bronze Age economy of Ireland. Environmental and demographic changes accompanied these technological developments. During the Bronze Age, Ireland's climate deteriorated, and large-scale deforestation occurred as land was cleared for farming and settlement. By the end of the period, the population of Ireland is estimated to have exceeded 100,000 people and may have reached as high as 200,000. This figure may not have been significantly higher than the population peak during the Neolithic period, suggesting periods of both growth and stability rather than continuous expansion. In Ireland, the Bronze Age lasted until around 500 BC, which is notably later than in much of continental Europe, and also later than in Britain. This extended duration reflects the distinctive pace at which technological and social changes unfolded on the island, setting the stage for the developments that would characterize the subsequent Iron Age. The Irish Iron Age has traditionally been dated from around 500 BC and is thought to have continued until the early Christian period, when written records began to appear and Ireland moved out of prehistory. This conventional timeline has been challenged by more recent archaeological discoveries. In particular, carbon dating of the wooden shaft of an iron spearhead found in the River Inny near Lacan produced a date range of between 811 and 673 BC. This finding suggests that ironworking may have been present in Ireland earlier than previously assumed, and complicates the idea that the arrival of iron technology neatly coincided with the arrival of Celtic or Indo-European speaking peoples. There has long been debate over when Celtic culture and Indo-European languages first reached Ireland. Some scholars associate their arrival with the Iron Age, while others argue that these influences were introduced earlier by the Bell Beaker populations during the Bronze Age, who were likely Indo-European speakers. The earlier dating of iron artifacts adds further complexity to this discussion and suggests that cultural and technological transitions in Ireland did not occur in simple or uniform stages. The Celtic languages of Britain and Ireland, collectively known as Insular Celtic, are divided into two main branches, Gaelic and Brittonic. When the earliest written records of Celtic languages appear in the 5th century AD, Ireland is associated with Gaelic, or Gaelic, in the form of Primitive Irish. Britain, by contrast, is associated with Brittonic, specifically Common Brittonic. This linguistic division reflects earlier patterns of cultural development on the two islands. During the Iron Age, the Roman Empire came to dominate much of neighboring Britain, and Roman interest in the region led to some of the earliest written references to Ireland. The 2nd century geographer Ptolemy recorded the names of several Irish tribes, some of which closely resemble the names of tribes in Britain and Gaul. These include the Brigantes, who shared a name with a major tribe in northern and central Britain, the Manapiae, possibly linked to the Menapiae of northern Gaul, and the Coriandai, whose name resembles that of tribes in Britain such as the Corianotote. Throughout this period, the Gaels maintained contact with the Roman world through both trade and conflict. Gaelic groups raided Roman Britain and also established colonies there, particularly toward the end of Roman rule between roughly 200 and 500 AD. Roman writers referred to these raiders as the Scoti and called their homeland Hibernia, or Scotia. Initially, the term Scoti applied to all Gaels in both Ireland and Britain, but over time it came to refer specifically to the Gaels of northern Britain. As Roman authority in Britain weakened, Gaelic raiding and settlement intensified. These movements contributed to lasting cultural and demographic changes on both sides of the Irish Sea. Meanwhile, within Ireland itself, political organization during the Iron Age remained highly fragmented. The island was divided into numerous small clan territories and kingdoms, known as tuatha, each ruled independently. This decentralized structure would continue to shape Irish society into the early medieval period. Roman writers recorded that the Irish people were divided into a number of distinct groups, with one account describing them as consisting of 16 different nations or tribes. Although Ireland was known to the Romans, traditional historical accounts suggest that Rome never attempted a full conquest of the island, even if such an idea may have been considered. Ireland was not isolated from the wider European world, however. Irish groups regularly raided Roman territories and also maintained trade links with the Roman Empire, ensuring ongoing contact despite the absence of direct Roman rule. Christianity reached Ireland sometime before the 5th century. During the mid-5th century, Palladius was sent by Pope Celestine I and is traditionally regarded as the first bishop of Ireland. The introduction of Christianity marked a major turning point in Ireland's external relations and internal development. Early Christian Ireland emerged from a period of population decline and reduced living standards that archaeological evidence suggests lasted from roughly AD 100 to 300. This era, sometimes referred to as the Irish Dark Age, saw the population become entirely rural and widely dispersed. The largest centers of settlement were ring forts, small enclosed farmsteads that dominated the landscape. Around 40,000 ring forts are known today, though the true number may have reached as high as 50,000. Archaeologists generally agree that most of these were farm enclosures belonging to relatively prosperous members of early medieval Irish society. Many ring forts included souterrains, underground passages, and chambers used for hiding, storage, or escape. Raiding Britain for slaves and valuable goods likely played an important role in supporting what was otherwise a largely agricultural economy. This raiding activity helped supplement local production and reinforce the importance of cattle and land as measures of wealth. From around AD 200 onward, cereal farming became increasingly significant. Barley and oats were the most important crops, while rye, wheat, and others played a lesser role. Cattle held enormous social and economic value, and cattle raiding was a central feature of warfare during this period. Herds required constant supervision during the day and were enclosed at night for protection. At the same time, large-scale forest clearance took place, and by the 9th century, extensive woodland had become rare. Native Scots pine was reduced almost to extinction as a result of sustained deforestation. Ireland's recorded history begins in earnest with the spread of Christianity and the introduction of Latin literacy in the 5th century or slightly earlier. Compared to other societies in the British Isles, early Christian Ireland is relatively well documented, particularly in later periods. However, these sources are often complex and difficult to interpret. Many questions about early Christian Ireland remain unresolved, and ongoing research continues to produce new discoveries and revised interpretations of this formative era. A traditional historical view holds that during the 4th or 5th century, Gaelic language and culture were carried from Ireland to Scotland by settlers who established the Gaelic kingdom of Dal Riata along Scotland's western coast. This interpretation is largely based on medieval written sources from the 9th and 10th centuries. However, some scholars challenge this view, arguing that there is little archaeological or place name evidence to support a large-scale migration or takeover by a small elite group from Ireland. The Viking Age in Ireland began in 795, when small groups of Vikings started raiding coastal monastic settlements. These early attacks marked the beginning of a prolonged period of conflict and interaction between the Irish and Scandinavian peoples. By 853, the Viking leader Amlib had established himself as the first king of Dublin, and his dynasty, known as the Williamite, ruled the city for several decades. Throughout this period, warfare between Viking forces and Irish kingdoms was frequent, with repeated waves of raiders targeting monasteries and settlements across the island. Over the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking activity in Ireland shifted from purely raiding to settlement and trade. This transition led to the founding of several of Ireland's most important towns, including Dublin, Cork, Limerick, and Waterford. While the Vikings had a lasting impact on Ireland's urban development and introduced some Scandinavian loanwords into the Irish language, their overall cultural influence was limited. Many Irish people were taken as slaves and later intermarried with Scandinavians, contributing to closer genetic and cultural links, particularly with Icelandic populations. Despite Viking settlement, Gaelic Ireland remained politically fragmented and continued to consist of many semi-independent territories known as Tuatha. Alongside these local kingdoms, there existed a nominal High Kingship of Ireland. The High King functioned primarily as a symbolic and cultural leader, rather than as a ruler with direct control over the entire island. Sub-kings acknowledged his status, but retained real authority over their own territories. This system resembled later feudal kingship in some respects, but involved far more decentralized power. Viking rulers, particularly the kings of Dublin and other coastal settlements, sometimes recognized the Irish High King as their overlord. These relationships were pragmatic rather than absolute and reflected the complex political landscape of Ireland during the Viking Age, where alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties were the norm. By the 12th century, Ireland was not a unified state but a complex political landscape made up of numerous tuatha, or clan territories, organized into larger land units known as trichachet and grouped within provinces called cuigi. These territories were governed under Gaelic Brehon law, and their rulers competed for the title of Ard Rí, or High King of Ireland. Although the High King received tribute from other kings, he did not rule Ireland as a centralized or unitary state. What bound the island together was not political unity, but a shared culture, language, and legal system. Along the coast, the port towns of Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick were dominated by Norse Irish populations and ruled by their own leaders. In the north, the Make Lochlainn kings controlled much of what is now western and central Ulster, while the ancient Ualaid retained the east. In 1166, Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar, king of Connacht, was recognized by most Irish kings as High King of Ireland. Around this time, Dermot MacMurrough, king of Leinster, lost the protection of Muirchart Mac Lochlainn, the previous High King, who had died in 1156. Dermot was subsequently expelled from his kingdom by a confederation of Irish forces, led by the new High King. Refusing to accept exile, Dermot sailed to Bristol and sought assistance from Henry II of England. Henry granted Dermot permission to recruit forces among his subjects, on the condition that Dermot swear loyalty to him. A restored Dermot would also provide strategic advantages, including access to the fleet of Dublin for Anglo-Norman campaigns against Wales and Scotland. The first Norman knight to land in Ireland was Richard Fitz-Godbert de Roche in 1167, but the main Anglo-Norman invasion began in 1169, when forces including Welsh and Flemish mercenaries landed at Wexford. Within a short period, Leinster was reclaimed, and both Waterford and Dublin came under Dermot's control. Dermot strengthened his alliance by marrying his daughter Aoife to Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, in 1170, and named him heir to the Kingdom of Leinster. This alarmed Henry II, who feared the emergence of a powerful and potentially rival Norman state in Ireland. In response, Henry decided to intervene directly and assert his authority. Henry's intervention was supported by a papal bull issued in 1155 by Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope, granting Henry authority to invade Ireland in order to reform alleged ecclesiastical abuses. In 1171, Henry landed at Waterford with a large fleet, becoming the first King of England to set foot in Ireland. Dublin and Waterford were declared royal cities, and Henry granted his Irish territories to his youngest son, John, under the title Dominus Hibernia, or Lord of Ireland. When John later ascended the English throne, the lordship of Ireland came directly under the English crown. Most Irish kings acknowledged Henry's authority, possibly viewing him as a counterbalance to the expanding power of Leinster and the Hiberno-Normans. It remains unclear whether they understood the feudal obligations implied by this submission, or saw Henry as a distant High King who would soon depart. This situation led to the Treaty of Windsor in 1175 between Henry and Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar. However, with Dermot and Strongbow both dead and Henry back in England, the treaty quickly lost practical significance. Norman expansion continued unchecked, with John de Courcy conquering much of eastern Ulster in 1177, Raymond Fitzgerald capturing Limerick and much of northern Munster, and other Norman families carving out semi-independent lordships across the island. What followed was a shift from ruling over people to colonizing land. The Cambro-Norman invasion brought lasting changes, including the construction of walled towns, castles, and churches, the introduction of new agricultural practices, and an increase in commerce. Norman settlers attempted to impose feudalism onto Ireland's existing tribal and dynastic system, introducing rent payments and new landholding arrangements. While feudalism never fully took hold across much of Ireland, it marked a significant departure from an economy based largely on barter. Over time, many Normans adopted the Irish language and customs, intermarried with Gaelic families, and became culturally Gaelicized. Conversely, Irish society itself became increasingly Normanized. Many modern Irish surnames such as Burke, Roche, and Power reflect this period, particularly in Leinster and Munster. The Norman period also reshaped the Irish Church. Efforts were made to reorganize religious life around parishes and dioceses rather than monasteries, and hundreds of new churches were built between 1172 and 1348. The papal taxation records of 1303, often compared to the Domesday Book, represent the first systematic attempt to assess Ireland's wealth at the parish level. Canon law was applied primarily in areas under strong Norman control, while traditional Brehon law continued to operate elsewhere. The Brehon system relied on fines rather than imprisonment, with penalties determined by the status of the victim, contrasting sharply with Norman legal reforms. Despite their early dominance, Norman control proved fragile. From the 14th century onward, repeated Gaelic rebellions, lack of consistent support from the English crown, and major external crises weakened the lordship of Ireland. The European famine of 1315–1317 affected Ireland severely, and the Bruce invasion compounded the damage through widespread crop destruction. The arrival of the Black Death in 1348 devastated English and Norman urban populations far more than the dispersed rural Irish, leading to a resurgence of Irish language and customs. English authority contracted to the Pale, a fortified region around Dublin. Outside the Pale, many Hiberno-Norman lords intermarried with Gaelic nobility, adopted Irish customs, and opposed English authority. These lords became known as the Old English and were famously described as being more Irish than the Irish themselves. By the late 15th century, effective English control outside Dublin had largely collapsed. Distracted by the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, England left Ireland increasingly to local rulers, allowing Gaelic and Gaelicized lords to expand their power and bringing this phase of Anglo-Norman rule to a close. During the later Middle Ages, the Irish were active participants in trade across Europe. Irish merchants and travelers could be found on the continent, and they were distinguished from the English in one important way. While the English tended to rely on their own language or French, the Irish used Latin when operating abroad. Latin functioned as a shared language among educated people throughout Gaeldom, allowing Irish traders and scholars to engage more easily with the wider European world. According to the writer Sumas MacManus, Christopher Columbus is said to have visited Ireland in search of information about lands to the west. Irish names appear on crew lists preserved in the archives of Madrid, and it is claimed that an Irishman, Patrick Maguire, was the first to set foot in the Americas in 1492. Although other historians who closely examined the crew lists argue that no Irish or English sailors took part in the voyage. An English report from 1515 described Ireland as being divided into more than 60 Gaelic lordships and 30 Anglo-Irish lordships. In English usage, these territories were referred to as nations or countries, while the Irish term oiriacht referred both to the land itself and to the people governed by a lord. The word literally meant an assembly, reflecting the fact that Brehon courts were traditionally held in open-air gatherings, often on hills, where legal disputes within a lordship were resolved. The Tudor lawyer John Davies later remarked on the Irish people's attachment to their legal system, noting that there were few peoples who valued impartial justice as highly or accepted legal judgment so readily, even when rulings went against them, provided that the law itself was applied fairly. From 1536 onward, Henry VIII of England began a determined effort to bring Ireland fully under English control. The Fitzgerald dynasty of Kildare, which had effectively governed the English lordship of Ireland during the 15th century, had become unreliable, prompting Henry to move toward direct rule. To secure the cooperation of the Gaelic nobility while maintaining English authority, the policy of surrender and regrant was introduced. Under this system, Irish lords formally surrendered their lands to the English crown and then received them back under English law, allowing them to retain their status while becoming subjects of the king. In 1541, Ireland's status was formally changed from a lordship to a kingdom through the Crown of Ireland Act of 1542, partly in response to Henry's break with the papacy, which had previously claimed suzerainty over Ireland. Henry was proclaimed King of Ireland by the Irish Parliament, marking the first time that both Gaelic Irish princes and Hiberno-Norman aristocrats attended such a gathering. Although the institutions of government were now in place, extending royal authority across the entire island proved far more difficult and took nearly a century to achieve. The Tudor conquest of Ireland unfolded through a combination of negotiation and warfare. Several major rebellions, including those in Desmond, Tyrone, and Inishowen, were suppressed over the course of Elizabeth I's and James I's reigns. The defeat of the Gaelic alliance at the Siege of Kinsale in 1601, followed by the final suppression of resistance in Ulster by 1608, effectively ended the independence of the remaining Gaelic kingdoms. These events marked the conclusion of the Tudor conquest and the collapse of Ireland's traditional Gaelic political order. With the Union of the Crowns in 1603, James VI of Scotland also became King of England and Ireland. James viewed the Gaelic population as rebellious and uncivilized, and believed that Gaelic culture itself needed to be eliminated. He implemented policies of Anglicization, aimed at reshaping the Gaelic nobility according to English legal and social norms. At the same time, he initiated large-scale colonization of confiscated lands with English-speaking Protestant settlers from Britain, particularly in Ulster. This policy, later known as the Plantation of Ulster, was intended to create a loyal Protestant population and sever the long-standing cultural and historical links between Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland. The flight of the Earls in 1607, when the leading Gaelic lords of Ulster went into exile, is widely regarded as a decisive turning point in Irish history. Their departure effectively destroyed the remaining independent Gaelic nobility and cleared the way for the full implementation of plantation policies. From this point onward, English authorities in Dublin were able to exert far greater control over Ireland, establishing, or at least attempting to establish, a centralized government across the entire island and permanently disarming the Gaelic lordships. The 16th century Age of Discovery encouraged English interest in Ireland as a colonial project, particularly under the Tudor monarchs. Although Henry VIII had earlier introduced the policy of surrender and regrant, it was during the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary I that the first formal plantations were established in Ireland around 1550. These early plantations became a model for later English colonization efforts, not only in Ireland, but eventually across the wider British Empire. A major turning point came with the outright invasion and conquest carried out by England's new model army under Oliver Cromwell during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Cromwell's campaign was marked by extreme violence, including the use of scorched earth tactics and designated free fire zones. The effects of warfare were compounded by plague, famine, the harsh Cromwellian land settlements, and the expansion of plantation schemes. Together, these developments led to the further suppression of the Gaelic population and created a deliberate refugee crisis in the west of Ireland, where displaced communities were forced into marginal lands. The political upheavals continued with the glorious revolution of William and Mary in England and the corresponding Williamite War in Ireland. These events further weakened the position of the Gaelic Irish. The final remnants of Gaelic Ireland and its ancient nobility were effectively destroyed following Jacobite defeats at the Battle of the Boyne and the Battle of Aughrim. What followed was the consolidation of the Protestant ascendancy, accompanied by the introduction of restrictive anti-Catholic laws that limited the rights of the native population. Although England and Scotland were politically united in 1707, following the earlier union of the crowns in 1603, Ireland remained formally separate until 1800. One reason some Irish Catholics supported the idea of union was the promise of Catholic emancipation, which would have allowed Roman Catholic members to sit in Parliament. However, this promise was blocked by King George III, who argued that granting emancipation would violate his coronation oath. As a result, Catholic emancipation was delayed and not achieved until 1829. Despite centuries of colonization and Anglicization, the Gaelic foundations of Irish history continued to shape Irish identity. Christianity became an especially prominent expression of that identity. And in the period leading up to the Great Famine of the 1840s, many Catholic priests placed strong emphasis on parish spirituality. This contributed to a localized blending of Gaelic cultural traditions with Catholic religious practices, a fusion that remained deeply embedded in Irish society. During the Enlightenment period, Ireland produced a number of figures who made significant contributions to science, philosophy, and intellectual life. Among the most notable was the Anglo Irish scientist Robert Boyle, who lived from 1627 to 1691, and is widely regarded as the father of modern chemistry. His 1661 work, The Sceptical Chymist, laid foundational principles for the scientific study of matter. Boyle was also an atomist and is best known for formulating Boyle's law, which describes the relationship between pressure and volume in gases. His work placed Ireland firmly within the broader European scientific revolution. Another important figure was Rear Admiral Francis Beaufort, an Irish naval officer of Huguenot descent who lived between 1774 and 1857. Beaufort made a lasting contribution to science through the creation of the Beaufort scale, a system for measuring and describing wind force that remains in use today. In the 19th century, the mathematician George Boole, who lived from 1815 to 1864, developed Boolean algebra, a mathematical framework that would later become fundamental to computer science and digital logic. Boole spent the latter part of his life in Cork, where he continued his academic work. Ireland also contributed to advances in physics during this period. The 19th century physicist George Stoney introduced both the concept and the term electron, anticipating later developments in atomic theory. Stoney was closely connected to another prominent physicist, George Fitzgerald, who was his nephew. Together, figures like Boyle, Beaufort, Boole, and Stoney illustrate the extent to which Ireland participated in and contributed to Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment scientific thought, despite its relatively small population. In literature, Ireland's influence during this period was particularly striking. With a population of around 6 million people, Ireland produced a remarkable number of writers whose work had an enduring international impact. Irish literature developed in both the Irish and English languages, reflecting the island's complex linguistic history. Among the most notable figures were Jonathan Swift and Lawrence Sterne, whose satirical and experimental works shaped modern prose, as well as Oscar Wilde and Oliver Goldsmith, who became central figures in English-language literature. The literary tradition continued into the late 19th and early 20th centuries with writers, poets, and playwrights such as James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Beckett, Bram Stoker, W.B. Yeats, Seamus Heaney, and Brendan Behan. The Great Famine, known in Irish as An Gorta Mór, occurred between 1845 and 1849 and represents one of the most catastrophic periods in Irish history. It was triggered by the widespread failure of the potato crop, caused by a fungal disease known as potato blight. At the time, a large proportion of the Irish population depended almost entirely on potatoes for sustenance, particularly small tenant farmers and laborers. When the crop failed repeatedly over several consecutive years, it led to mass starvation, disease, and social collapse on an unprecedented scale. Although the potato blight affected other parts of Europe, its impact in Ireland was uniquely severe due to the existing economic and social conditions. Ireland was under British rule, and much of its agricultural land was owned by landlords, many of whom lived outside the country. Even during the famine years, large quantities of food, including grain and livestock, continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain. British government responses, shaped by laissez-faire economic policies and a belief in minimal state intervention, proved inadequate to address the scale of the disaster. As the famine deepened, hunger was accompanied by outbreaks of disease, including typhus, cholera, and dysentery. Entire communities were devastated, and the social fabric of rural Ireland began to collapse. Between 1 and 1.5 million people are estimated to have died as a direct or indirect result of the famine. At the same time, mass emigration became a defining feature of the period, as desperate families sought survival abroad. Emigration during and after the famine permanently altered Ireland's demographic profile. Millions of Irish people left the island, primarily for Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia. Many emigrants traveled in overcrowded and unsanitary ships that later became known as coffin ships due to the high mortality rates during the voyage. Those who survived helped establish large Irish diaspora communities, particularly in North America, which would continue to shape Irish political, cultural, and economic life in the decades that followed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Irish society was increasingly shaped by political movements seeking greater autonomy or independence from Britain. Cultural revival movements, such as the Gaelic Revival, aimed to preserve and promote the Irish language, traditional music, and literature, reflecting a growing desire to reclaim aspects of Gaelic identity that had been weakened over centuries of colonization. At the same time, political organizations advocating for home rule gained support, particularly among the Catholic population, although these efforts were repeatedly delayed or blocked within the British political system. The early 20th century saw a shift from constitutional nationalism to more radical forms of resistance. The Easter Rising of 1916, although initially unsuccessful as a military action, had a profound impact on public opinion. The execution of its leaders by British authorities transformed the uprising into a powerful symbol of resistance. This period was followed by the Irish War of Independence between 1919 and 1921, which led to the signing of the Anglo Irish Treaty. The treaty established the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Commonwealth, while also confirming the partition of the island, with Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. The treaty divided Irish society and led directly to the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 1923, fought between pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. Although the pro-treaty side emerged victorious, the conflict left deep political and social divisions that shaped Irish politics for decades. Over time, the Irish Free State gradually reduced its constitutional ties to Britain, culminating in the declaration of the Republic of Ireland in 1949. Northern Ireland, meanwhile, remained within the United Kingdom, with a predominantly Protestant population and a separate political trajectory. In recent decades, both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland have continued to evolve within their respective political frameworks. Ireland has become a more diverse and outward-looking society, shaped by immigration, economic development, and ongoing cultural change. At the same time, debates over national identity, history, and the legacy of partition remain central to Irish political and cultural life, reflecting the long and complex historical processes that have shaped the Irish people.